guys, and welcome to the Serie Chronicles. And we're recording on a very, very busy Tuesday morning. And you can already hear Ross is barking because it is barking mad in Italian football at the moment. News just broke that Jose Mourinho has been relieved of duties at Roma. But before we get into this, I just want to ask you to give us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. It helps us to be found, and so we can attract even more listeners. For our Chronicles Tifosi Patreons, make sure you join the chat in the Patreon app. Hello and welcome to Patrick Kendrick and Nikki Bandini. How are you guys?
Very well, thank you. Excited to get into the big topic of the day, Mourinho. There's nothing worse in life, is there, than not being talked about, and that certainly doesn't apply to Mourinho, I think. So.
You know what? As soon as this news broke, right, in my head, I'm like, Patrick's loving this. Like, he's just gonna love. Like, if Schadenfreude can be used to describe a man, yeah, like I just kind of feel like it would be you. What about you, Nikki? You were expecting this sort of?
Well, sort of yes and sort of no. I wrote a piece for The Guardian just yesterday saying I think the writing's on the wall, but I didn't necessarily expect it to happen today. As I was just saying to you before we started, this is very important information for our listeners, but I was supposed to wash my hair last night knowing I was going to be doing much stuff on camera. I thought, too tired, I'll do it in the morning. And I wake up in the morning to the news and you're like, oh God, I'm just going to do everything looking like a bag of rags, but whatever. It's the interesting days in football journalism, isn't it? When there's news that happens, and this is certainly news.
You know what it is? It is that kind of stuff as well. Like, for women, it's like, oh, I'll just put it off. And stuff always happens when you put it off, you know? Anyway, I promised myself that I start going to the gym as soon as New Year hit. We are on the 16th of Jan. I haven't gone once anyway. But I'm paying for it, so... Who stupidly still goes and does these things for New Year's resolutions? Anyway, ignoring all of this, let's get into it because I can feel Patrick is frothing at the mouth. Okay, guys.
Like if you rabid dog.
By the way, I'm exaggerating.
A rabid wolf in this case, yeah, absolutely.
So then I'm not exaggerating at this point. Right, just to give you some context, obviously there were Coppa Italia games. And we saw some interesting performances, perhaps none more so than Lazio defeating Roma 1-0. That was
interesting isn't the word for the actual performance, but interesting the result maybe. Good God.
Well, yes, and so rumours started. This was looking bad for Roma, obviously. And then question marks about Mourinho. But of course, there was a big match coming up against Milan. Now, this was going to be even more interesting because both Stefano Pioli and Jose Mourinho have been under pressure considering the performances of their respective clubs this season. Milan have been knocked out of the Coppa Italia and, of course, of the Champions League, whereas Roma have pretty much lost too many derbies to Lazio, lying in 9th at the moment after a 3-1 loss to Milan, in which Milan actually seemed to reclaim former glories, show and produce a powerful performance. We saw the very best of Giroud and the very best perhaps of even Stefano Pioli, who showed us what tactics can do to ensure the win. Now, it's also worth noting that Mourinho obviously was without Paulo Dybala. I always like to say that because people say it's not an alibi, but I do think it's important to sometimes note that big absences make a difference. Except Dybala's almost always absent for Roma these days. Nonetheless, Tuesday morning, it was released that Roma had now parted ways with Jose Mourinho. They put a picture up of him and thanked him after winning the award of the conference for the Conference League, saying we'll always have great memories. And now it's supposed to be Daniele De Rossi, who could be the next coach. But before we get into all of that, Patrick, here's your chance, baby.
Blimey. Okay, that's a big build-up. Yeah, I think we have to take everything into context, don't we? I mean, unfortunately, it's happened again. It's third season Mourinho. He hasn't completed a third season. That's been the trend. Excuse me. It's been the trend at his most recent jobs. Certainly, you know, I think he was at his best when he was leaving after a couple of seasons. We saw it with Porto. We saw it with Inter as well. Obviously, Chelsea, he lost his job the first time around, but it just feels like it was inevitable with the results that they weren't getting, and he went into full-on crisis mode where he was talking up his achievements and seemed to be suggesting that there were enemies within the club as well. I think we saw that after his derby defeat to Lazio. That's now 4 derbies in a row where they haven't scored. He's lost 4 of his first 6 against Sarri. Sarri was the first Lazio coach since Sven-Göran Eriksson to win 4 of his first 6 derbies. I think it's nice to take the opportunity as well to just, stress the legacy that Sven-Göran Eriksson has in Italian football as well, given the sad news recently about his health issues. But I think Mourinho had this bizarre performance, and it was nothing more than a performance in his press conference on Saturday when he immediately addressed criticism before they even took questions. He said, I want to make a statement, and he went on this bizarre rant about how he is the embodiment of professionalism, which, without a hint of irony, which was quite amusing given all of the antics that has gone with him, accompanied him throughout his career. And it was all due to the fact that on Thursday he had taken a personal day, and people questioned the timing of that, a day on from losing yet another derby and going out of the Coppa Italia, one competition that on paper Roma could feasibly win. He decided to take a day off, and he said, this is outrageous. It's the first day I've ever missed training in 23 years of my career, not just at Roma, and so on and so forth. Then he started going on about how he felt betrayed by his players again. There was a lot of this. I think he sensed he was very close to the exit. He knew that he was suspended for the Milan game, which meant he probably wasn't going to speak after the game. I think he sensed that his team could lose as well. He will justify that by saying that Roma simply don't have the same squad depth as Milan. He frequently stressed the point that the Milan squad is built to challenge for the Scudetto, whereas his team is not. And he's always trying to make
his team that costs more in wages than Milan's team does.
Absolutely. It's this constant reframing of the narrative where he's turning water into wine and so on and so forth. And I think, he used to be the special one. I think the only special achievements he's had at Roma, besides the Conference League, and I think we'll get on to his legacy, and I'll probably let Nikki to broach that. But I think if we're looking at what's happened recently, then his most recent tangible achievement is filling a stadium. And that's quite a damning indictment, I think. I was reacting to this with some colleagues earlier on, and someone said, that's the end of the sellouts. And I said, is that really what they're going to miss most from Mourinho recently, is the fact that the Olimpico is full at every home game? If that's the only thing they're going to miss, then they're probably, in the long term, better off without him, albeit I don't think this season is necessarily going to improve anytime soon.
Nikki, are they better? Okay, sorry, go on.
No, I just to jump on that. Like I think with Mourinho, it is complicated, and I think that with Mourinho, there's always going to be 2 camps, and those 2 camps are never going to see eye to eye. And as usual, I find myself, because this is who I am, trying to sort of chart that course in the middle and to acknowledge both sides of things. But I do think it's slightly over limiting it to say, well, it's just the Europa Conference League, because they did get to within a penalty shootout of winning the Europa League last season. And I think that when you're talking about margins as fine as that, you're talking about spot kicks defining whether or not we're talking about, do you not think if they win that shootout and he stops there, which he wouldn't have probably, but if he had, people would have looked at this as an unambiguously successful era. It would have been an unambiguously successful era. It would have been 2 European trophies. It would have been a return to the Champions League. It would have been right off into the sunset with that glory. But instead, what happens is not only do you lose that Champions League final, but then you have that hideous behaviour with Anthony Taylor after the game, and now the memory of it for a lot of people is the complete opposite. It was a game which they messed up. It was a situation in which Jose didn't carry himself well, and I think that for me as well, what happened afterwards perhaps is one of the early death knells. Is when the club sort of gives him a nudge to maybe try and be a bit more conciliatory and to speak out against the fans who were going after the officials in the airport. And he's saying, well, I'm not doing that until someone speaks up for me, and he's always turned it back to himself. It's not new. That is Jose. I think his league performance is unambiguously poor, and I know that there's going to be Roma fans who disagree with that, but the numbers speak for themselves. In the Opta had a stat that they put out today, which I thought was absolutely damning, which is since Serie A went to 3 points for a win. If you look at Roma managers who've had more than 50 games in charge, he has the worst points return. The worst, not sort of somewhere in the middle, the actual worst, 1.61 points a game. You think he was replacing Paulo Fonseca, who had finished in essentially exactly
My
the same
hero.
positions, with less spending. And this narrative of, he hasn't spent any money the last 2 summers is, for me, that's the one part of this conversation you just throw that straight in the bin, because they had more than €100 million net spend the first season Jose was there, and their wage bill has been consistently one of the highest in the division. So the idea that they haven't had resources put in just because this last summer they tried to recoup some of that, no, not having that one at all.
Okay, I want to ask you a serious question. So we know that Jose Mourinho, when it comes to his football, has been terrible. But here's the thing, right? I agree with you. I agree with a lot of what you've just said. I agree with you that he was this close to winning another final. He was, I think, the last coach who defeated Bayer Leverkusen, because these people still haven't suffered a loss since.
And by the way, Mina, as well, like that final specifically, I know like the Dybala thing, always injured, is part of the Dybala project, but genuinely, if Dybala plays 90 minutes, I think they win that game. The difference in that final when he was there and when he wasn't was huge.
I will be pushing back against the fine margins narrative very shortly, but Mina, you carry on.
I guess my question is that I always feel that it takes a group effort. Well, I'm not always, but I do think that it's a bit of a group effort. Like, how much can we blame him entirely for the way that Roma's season is going? Or is it the choices of the club in general when it comes to recruitment, when it comes to, bringing in these players that they're so fascinated by? I mean, when Thiago Pinto did this, did the interview and started explaining the fact way, he just would suggest these little ideas, or maybe Lukaku can come to us, or maybe Dybala, and always as in jest. And then when he gets to them, he just feels like the big cheese that scored the great victory of signing these players. It's all good and well because Lukaku at least is always available to you. But when you have Pellegrini, when you have Renato Sanchez, when you have Dybala, always injury-prone players, you're leaving Mourinho with not much opportunity to really try to build something. Am I finding excuses for him at this point?
Yes and no. I think the manager will always have a say in recruitment, and he has ultimately sanctioned those signings as well. And I think you can't have it both ways. You can't try and brand it as or frame it as, I'm Mourinho, I'm able to attract all of these great players. Lukaku wants to play with me again. Dybala wants to come to the club because I'm at the club. Even recently with Frosinone, I mean, it's a ridiculous thing. Dean Huijsen, the 18-year-old, he doesn't go to Frosinone, he goes to Roma because he snubs Di Francesco in favour of Mourinho. Then he gives away the crucial penalty in a derby and so on and so forth. That was a very unfortunate series of events. But I think you can't have it both ways. Either you say, yes, I want these players, I need star power, Roma needs these big personalities, but they do come with a checkered injury record. You can't then say, we only get these players because they have bad injury records and no one will touch them. Well, which is it? Are you getting them because you're able to convince them to come, or are you getting them because no one else wants them? Do you know, there's always an excuse, unfortunately. And I just want to come back to the fine margins thing. And I have really gone the opposite way in Mourinho's career. I was a huge Mourinho fanboy growing up. Massive. I mean, that comes with supporting Southampton. You don't really get much in the way of joy. So you look for these sort of great personalities and winners. And I loved him winning with Porto and bursting on the scene, and then the Chelsea years and Inter. And it was just incredible. It was just high after high after high. But his whole career has been built on fine margins. Lest we forget, he wins at Old Trafford because Cristina scores in the 90th minute and they knock out Manchester United, and Porto go on to win the Champions League, if memory serves. He will always talk to you about the ghost goal, which is true, but there are other...
that was a ridiculous one. The ghost goal was if it wasn't given, then it's a red card and a penalty. So that one was always a bit of a red herring, I thought.
But no, absolutely. And even Inter, do you remember when Inter won the treble? They nearly went out in the group stage. I think they scored a last-minute goal. Who was it, against Werder Bremen or something like that? So he has built his career on these fine margins. If you actually look back and you were to say, well, you got the rub of the green there, I think you have to take the rough with the smooth. And then, if things have panned out your way in the early portion of your career because you have this force of personality and your players will die for you, then the players just get a little bit tired. And unfortunately, players also read the press They watch coverage of football. They see how he's behaved at other clubs. They see how things haven't turned out. They see that eventually there comes a time when he no longer is able to get the same performances out of players, and it's all stick and never carrot. And I think, you can't accuse your players of betraying you. You can't say our wing-backs are useless, all their crosses are rubbish, because it's not conducive to getting an improvement out of the team. And I think the writing was on the wall when he starts to criticise the players.
I think that's... Sorry, you go. I've been talking about...
No. I just want to say, there is no Smalling. They sold Ibanez. Mancini is pretty much dying at this point. I feel like he has honestly played so many games, and I could really use a few weeks without seeing that guy on my screen. But I do feel like there's just been, Tammy Abraham hasn't come back. This is not me to try to in any way, because you know how I feel about Jose Mourinho, but I do also feel like there has just been a lot, and he hasn't. Listen, he makes bad choices, because again, you put Lukaku up there and you put him next to El Shaarawy, and you didn't bring on Belotti, and you know that he performs better when he's next to another player, because Lukaku he can't do it on his own, right? And you're seeing the way that Milan is panning out. It's almost like he was trying to get fired. This is what I didn't understand. It was like he was trying to get fired in that particular game. But yes, does he speak badly? Yes, but he packs the stadium. He's brought you sponsorship deals. The fans have loved him. I mean, people say that they've turned against him. Yes, of course, they've booed, yes, but they come and watch him. And there was every opportunity that even though he didn't win the group in the Europa League, he would still manage to make it to the latter stages. You always believe with Mourinho. Generally speaking, should we not have a bigger problem with the way this club is being run and what their actual long-term desires are? What is going to happen now?
Because of Jose, aren't they run would this club have made the decisions it's made financially if it wasn't for Jose being there and saying, well, I'm here and you have to back me? I think it's so difficult to untangle some of those things. The fan thing, my sense is still that Roma supporters overwhelmingly support Mourinho. Of course, you can't do an actual poll of every Roma supporter in the world, but I think in Rome especially, of course, there are different categories of supporter, right? And I'm not saying anyone's support is more or less valid than someone else's, but I do think online supporters and the supporters who are in the city are sometimes two different animals. And I think that within the city, there's still overwhelming support for him. And I think that this is the bit where I want to push back. I've just said that I think his league record is flat bad, and I think to me it's inexcusable. You can talk to me about injury lists if you want to. I can have a measure of sympathy, but this weekend you were up against Stefano Pioli, who's had to deal with half a centre back for half of the season. I don't buy it. I'm sorry, they're third in the league, and they're again spending less on wages than you are. But I do think that as a supporter, as a football fan, I think that people sometimes need to step back again from that very online, in my opinion, discourse about, well, did he finish in the top four? Because actually winning a cup means something when you go to the stadium, when you go places. Getting to celebrate a first piece of silverware in a decade and a half, that's amazing. That's something that, especially a European trophy for a club that hadn't won anything since the Intercity Fairs Cup in 1961, winning a European trophy will make a memory for your lifetime. And when you have a manager who's done that for you, I think the loyalty coming with that is completely natural. I think the not taking that seriously is also wrong. I think that what he did in terms of winning a European trophy, coming so close to winning another one, is extraordinary. But he accompanied it with everything that he always accompanies it with the breakdowns, with the throwing heaps of his team under the bus. I mean, don't forget, on the way to that Europa Conference League, they lost 6-1 to Bodo Glimt.
Yep.
And then it was half the squad needs to go. So with the throwing the players under the bus, with throwing the board under the bus, and I do think that when sort of people want to understand really what's happened here, I think that's when you have to remember that in the end, it's not the fans who make the decisions, it is the board. And to the board, finishing in the top four is the most important thing, because they've spent heaps of money. They're fighting incredibly hard to try and bring 100 million euro deficits down to meet financial fair play restrictions. And if you don't ever get those Champions League revenues, which right now they're not going to, it becomes harder and harder and harder.
But the Conference League, is that any bigger than the Coppa Italia? Because he's taken charge of what is it, 3 Coppa Italia? No, I can't remember what he did in his first season with the Coppa Italia, but there's an exit to Cremonese last season. There's an exit to Lazio this season. They went behind to the Cremonese again in the round of 16. You know, it's not like...
But no, Patrick, it's bigger. It's the first European Cup. I mean, and he was the first to win that.
It's the third-tier European trophy, though, isn't it?
Sure.
I mean, it's been made big by the fact Roma and West Ham have won it and have decided to say it's a big triumph for them because they've gone decades without winning major silver. You know, the Lazio fans just say it's a nothing, coppetta, you know, it's just...
Right, but Lazio's own manager thinks that the Coppa Italia is the dumbest tournament in the world, and that's something that Mila's talked about. I loved Sarri's week, by the way, after winning that game. Going to the semi-final of the Coppa Italia, you'd think it'd be like, oh, this is great. Because actually, I don't give a stuff about the Coppa Italia. I'm just glad we won the derby.
Exactly. You know, and then that's him saying what the fan base wants to hear as well. It's difficult, isn't it? Because we don't know much about the Friedkins, do we? Ryan and Dan and Ryan, the father and son duo, because they seem to keep themselves to themselves. And I do wonder whether they've just become fed up with the noise that goes along with it. You know, if you're used to conducting yourself in a certain way and you like to be considered as classy operators in the business world, then you invest in a football club. And despite the visceral, passionate support and this, you know, iconic global personality, if he's in the headlines for more of the wrong reasons than the good reasons, I think there might just come a time when they said, okay, it's great in terms of visibility. Yes, we do get a full stadium. Yes, we get more sponsors revenue, but ultimately, would we be better off having someone who just, you know, toes the party line and develops players and works within the financial parameters that we establish, and maybe they might not finish top 4, but they finish 5th and they're got a chance of finishing in the top 4, going up to the final game. You know, lest we forget, Mourinho was brought in because Paulo Fonseca couldn't beat any of the other members of the 7 Sisters, or 8 Sisters if you want to include Fiorentina in that. And Mourinho's record is barely any better than what Fonseca achieved. So I think you have to look at it from the majority of the games he's taken charge of. You know, either you write off the league and say, we don't mind, we're just going to stay up, and your remit is to win one piece of silverware, be it a European or a domestic trophy or otherwise. Or you say to him, we want you to finish in the Champions League, which I believe was his primary target. He hasn't done it. He has now shifted the narrative because he said, I won the Conference League, I got to the Europa League final, which is outrageously good because, you know, you get into the Europa League as a seed by winning the Conference League. Had they won the Europa League on that penalty shootout, he'd have got them in the Champions League, much like he did with Manchester United when he didn't finish in the top 4. And then suddenly he's won back-to-back trophies in 2 straight seasons, European silverware. It's incredible. And so I completely take your point, Nikki, that had they beaten Sevilla on that penalty shootout, and by the way, then they would have been the team that beat Sevilla in a Europa League final, something that no one had ever done. But again, they didn't. So history remembers the victors. And I think, you know, he will now use that Europa League final. He's already started to do it, but he'll use that Europa League final in much the same way that he said, I won a trophy at every club apart from Tottenham, where they didn't let me take charge of the Capital One or whatever it was branded as then, the League Cup final, you know, when they sacked him and Ryan Mason took charge.
Do you guys not just think, though, that like if he had just, because at the time it was his moment, it was received with triumphalism that Mourinho at the end of that game against Sevilla, he did that pointing at the floor gesture, I'm staying here. And everyone was excited about it because it really hadn't been clear going into that final if it could be the end for him, win or lose. Do you not think that even though it was a loss, I just think if he'd left it would have been perceived in a completely different light to how it's now going to be
100%.
Which is why I have question marks about all of it. Like, why? I'll be honest with you. When he started weaponizing the fans, you know, you're the best, you're the very best. I've been to Real Madrid, I've been to Chelsea, I've been to the best clubs in the world, you know, but like, you are the best. And then it was almost like this way to apply pressure on the Friedkins to get that contract extension. Everyone wanted me. Saudi wanted me. I'll go there eventually, but I want to stay here. Roma's special. It was bizarre to me. I'm not going to lie. It's true. You did coach Real Madrid. You did coach like some of the biggest clubs in the world. Why are you doing all of this? If everyone wants you, like you say they do, and I'm not doubting him. What is it that you're getting? Because you're complaining every day. So it doesn't sound like you're having the time of your life. You're not producing something that, you know, your legacy is benefiting from any of it. You haven't created this bunch of players, you know, for Roma from the youth team, or I mean, you're getting them into the Champions League. You're not. You're winning these sort of cups that, it's a conference cup, and it's another
He got it
Europa League.
tattooed on his shoulder. He got it tattooed.
So do you think that he really loved his job? Like, I'm trying to sort of make sense of it. You think that is?
I think season one it was an adventure, and he fell in
He
love
wanted
with
to
Rome.
extend. So he wanted what, another 2 seasons at this club?
Yeah.
I think he wanted to extend so that he was also safeguarded against, he would have a financial payoff if he were dismissed as well. There's not much to pay him off now, is there, if he's out of contract at the end of the season. I think you're right, Nikki. I think Mourinho loves records and being the first man to do something. And he was the first man to win all 3 European club competitions. And he did so basically at the first time of asking in its inaugural edition. So, yeah. It's all about him. It's always been about him. It's hugely impressive. And I really don't want this to come across as I am disregarding Jose Mourinho as a coach. I think he's one of the greatest coaches of all time, 26 pieces of silverware. I just think there is a marked difference between the first 7-8 years of his career and then the time after that. I think from Porto right up to the second spell at Chelsea, when he comes back and wins the league there, I think that is one of the coaches at the peak of his powers, and he could have easily won the Champions League with Real Madrid, or at least got them to the final. And he could have easily done likewise with, because wasn't it Mourinho? Real Madrid hadn't gone past the round of 16, and didn't Mourinho come in and get a couple of semi-finals?
Exactly. They kept losing to Lyon, and he kept
losing semi-finals as well at Chelsea as well. So he could easily have 4 Champions Leagues with 4 different teams. But equally, as we said earlier, there are also times when things went his way. But I just think the recent jobs he's had, he's still won things. You have to say the United job, given what we've learned since with the other managers that have gone in there in the post-Ferguson era, you have to look at that as a success. You have to look at his overall time at Roma, 2.5 seasons, as a success, because he won the Conference League and very nearly, he was runners-up in the Europa League. But has he left the club in a better place than where he picked it up? I think that's always what it comes down to.
Well, let's talk about Roma, because I think we've given Jose Mourinho enough time. I also want to do a little apology to Andrea Azzoli, who also got sacked for Empoli, but won't get any of this coverage. But let's talk about Roma and their future and the decision to this. Are they better off now? Because if it is Daniele De Rossi, the man who only achieved 3 wins in 17 matches for Spal, is he the right guy to take over this squad? Or,
it's a fascinating little piece of history, isn't it? When you think that De Rossi was, for a time, would have had Mourinho as his great antagonist, because that Roma team was pushing to win the title, and of course in the year of the treble, 2010, really did push into right to the very end. And then Mourinho left and went off to Real Madrid, and for I think 2 or 3 summers there was this sort of recurring story that Mourinho wanted to bring De Rossi to Real Madrid with him, and De Rossi even said some things at the time that made it sort of sound like he was open to it. So they've got this sort of history together of being rivals, and then I guess of admiration, and now he's stepping into first boots. There's nothing that we know about De Rossi, and of course it's almost impossible to make judgments for the new manager, but there's nothing we know that suggests he's ready for this, really. He's been an assistant to Roberto Mancini for the national team in 2 stints, and he's had one situation where he's been first team manager at Spal that, as you said, Mina, didn't go well. So we have nothing concrete to hold on to and say, yes, this guy's shown he's got the chops to step in and do that job. I think the expectations probably are not going to be that he can step in and be the next brilliant manager. I think we're back in that situation we see again and again in Italy, which is you can't hire from another club a manager in the same season within Serie A. So your options are you going to go and look for one of those few really top level managers who are currently out of work, so for instance Antonio Conte, or are you going to say, what can we do to get to the end of the season? And the one thing that is sort of interesting with De Rossi is, well, maybe it is or isn't interesting. It was interesting to me. His dad's been involved for a really long time.
The U19s.
With the under-19s. And I wonder if there's just a thought of, first of all, here's someone who the fans will swallow because they love him, even though he's not Mourinho. And also who has a connection through his family to what's going on with the youth team. And frankly, given the strong likelihood they're going to miss out on the Champions League this season, maybe an acknowledgement that next season really is going to have to be about we cut back even more and we look at our youth system and see what it can give us.
I understand this, but it's starting to look like that Roma is just not a well-run club. It's a case of we appease the fans, we try to do the best we can with what we have. There is no long-term strategy. There isn't a long-term plan. It seems like, we'll bring in this guy who has very, very, it's like bringing in Pirlo for Juventus, except at the time.
But mid-season, so even harder.
Precisely. And you don't have Ronaldo who can put a plaster on it with all his goals. So because you can hope that Lukaku could put a poster because he's not Ronaldo. Do you see what I mean? So,
in fairness to Pirlo, he had exactly the same first season with Juventus that Simone Inzaghi had with Inter. He just wasn't given the chance to have a second season. He won the Coppa Italia and the Supercoppa.
Yeah, well, precisely, exactly that. I mean, he had Ronaldo. So, but I feel like Ronaldo just covers over a lot of stuff. But I do sort of feel like I don't know what the long-term strategy of this club is, and I'm starting to doubt their ability to really know how to invest in the market, go for the right players that they need right now. When for so long, I feel like they've started to chase the wrong players. When you can see sort of the kids. Even Milan, who have brought in a lot of players, have still given a lot of youngsters their opportunities because of injuries, because of what happened. And yes, Roma now have Bove as a fully fledged member and all of that. But this seems like a team that doesn't really have a clear understanding. We're going to sack this guy. We're going to bring in this guy because everyone loves him. Either Mourinho was a strategy because you wanted to grow yourself as a commercial brand, as a brand in general, which, by the way, Mourinho significantly did for Roma. He brought a lot of eyes. I mean, there is not one time that I did a damn podcast on Italian football that I wasn't asked about Jose Mourinho's Roma. I never really spoke about Roma in any of these big European podcasts before he came along. I could never sit there and talk to them about, Spalletti's Roma or Fonseca's Roma. No one was interested. So Jose Mourinho bought eyes. Jose Mourinho bought in players that everyone remembers. I mean, Dybala sat there crying as the entire of City came to welcome him. And a lot of that had to do with the pull of Dybala. And of Mourinho. And so I'm saying I can understand that strategy. But then you're going for Daniele De Rossi strategy. Just seems like a way of just plastering and putting a plaster on all of this and saying, well, we're just going to try to appease the fans. And that worries me about the long-term planning of this club in general.
I don't see it that way. I see it as, it reminds me a lot of Manchester United with Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. It's let's bring in a club legend because morale is at an all-time low. We're cutting our losses because the situation has become untenable. Roma
and you think that's a well-run club?
I wasn't saying that. I think Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, won 17 and drew one of his first 19 matches in charge. Occasionally, football is quite simple. You give the players a lift, you give them confidence, you say, go and play with freedom, expectations are low, go out there and entertain the fans. We're not going to finish in the top four. You start saying that, and then suddenly you find yourself at the end of March and you're 3 points off the Champions League places. And that's not to say Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was a better tactician than Mourinho. That's just to say that it's an easier act to follow at that moment in time because he happens to have ended, as always is the case when a manager gets sacked, it's the lowest ebb of their time in charge. So I think there's an argument to say, bring someone in who knows the club in terms of what the club represents in terms of values, not in terms of knowing who the kit man is and all that nonsense, but in terms of Roma want to fill the stadium, yes, but they also want to play exciting football. They want to get excited again and not just necessarily win matches because an opposition player's got sent off or because, it's just it's been far too cynical recently. And we did predict this coming up as well. I think we looked at it and said, okay, Roma have won 7 of their last 9, but we also looked at their opponents and we also saw that coming up they had games against Inter, Napoli, Juventus, Atalanta, Milan, plus the derby. And I don't think they've won a single one apart from Napoli, a Napoli side coached by Walter Mazzarri that lost 3-0 at Torino and nearly drew against Salernitana. So I think it's a case of cut our losses now and we are writing off Champions League qualification. We wouldn't have qualified for the Champions League, even though they will say, they're only 5 points off the top 4, etc. You've got to look at that sort of downward trend. And I think it's a case of saying, we'll give De Rossi 6 months. No one expects him to keep the job. I think they need to resist the temptation to give him the job full-time, even if they were to go on a Solskjaer-style run. I think this is a way of saying we're going to give ourselves 6 months now to ponder who we're going to hire as our next head coach, in the fact that we don't have a general manager because Thiago Pinto's leaving at the start of February.
Yes.
And that way they can come together, take time and say, get us through to the end of the season. Let's try and finish in Europe. But and then we're going to have a clean slate in the summer, which they would have probably had anyway if they decided against giving Mourinho a new contract, which it appeared they had.
I think Patrick just touched on something really important there, which is Thiago Pinto. I think that, so officially Thiago Pinto is, I think, the general manager of football. There's sort of use of terminology that's much more like, I suppose, what that role is described as in American sports, often general manager rather than sporting director, but it's the same sort of role. And I think that you see this often. The reason American sports is in my head is that you see this often in American sports when they're looking to, of course, American ownership is the other reason it's in my head. That you see this often in American sports when they're looking at that point of we need to start over. This sort of era is an end. It's often sort of perceived and talked about that you have to get the right general manager in place first and then make sure that that person is getting to pick the next coach. Because, yes, the owners are going to be the ones who sign off on the contract, but the general manager is going to set the direction in a sporting sense of where things go. And so if Pinto is on the way out, is it worth making your big hire at manager now when you know you're going to have a new general manager coming in and you need to have
I'm going to interrupt you because it's been made official. Daniele De Rossi is now the coach of Roma.
Oh, there you go.
So
DDR.
I'm just gonna read you a question from a Tifosi Patreon, Dan Almond, who says, "Does Roma have unrealistic expectation levels of what they might achieve going forward?" Unrealistic now that they've hired Daniele De Rossi?
Actually, Dan Almond would be a good person to get on the podcast because I know he goes to Spal home and away. So there you go. He does. Unfortunately, he's a Portsmouth fan back home, which is disappointing for him. But there you go. Sorry.
We're building bridges.
But Nikki, sorry, I interrupted you answering the question.
No, I just think that's it. I think it in terms of the next hire, it's almost hiring the next big manager now will be putting the cart before the horse. I think that from the ownership's perspective, it's going to be get the general manager who'll decide what direction we're heading in conjunction with us, of course, but who'll set the tone for the club and then make sure that general manager wants to work with the new manager. And I think that makes business-wise a lot of sense. Whether or not you might make the case that, well, then wasn't it worth just hanging on a little bit longer because Pinto's going next month? That's a whole different conversation. But I also, funnily enough, looking at the fixture list, you've just talked about how difficult that recent run of games was, and it was, Patrick. The next few games are much easier. Verona, Salernitana, Cagliari. These are games you would think Roma really should pick up points from. And I almost wonder if there was that fear that if we let him go on a bit, the momentum will start going the other way, and then it will be less easy to just make this decision. We need to rip the Band-Aid off and be done with it.
Okay, guys, just one last one because we must move on because there's a whole round of games that we haven't spoken about. But I do,
the Roma Chronicles.
It really is today, but it's something worth noting. So I've just seen a video of Mourinho leaving Roma's training center. He is absolutely mobbed by fans.
By sycophants.
They are screaming, "We love you."
Patrick said it, not us. To all those listening.
We love you. Thank you so much. We have no words. Thank you, Mr. Now, this is a good time to ask you a second question from a Tifosi Patreon member, Rich, who asked, how could Roma fans be so loyal to Mourinho when the football was so dire and the results so poor? I think we would have answered that, but just a quick sentence from you guys, and then we've got to move on to Milan.
Veneration. This is Rome, ancient Rome, emperors, gods, all of that just all of that heritage. I think there's something to that, and this is a club where Francesco Totti had his own room, basically, that was bigger than anything else. I can't remember which Roma coach it was, I think it may be Rudy Garcia. It was some Roma coach that he was just amazed by. No, it might even been Spalletti when he left the second time around. He just thought it was ludicrous, just the outsized personality that Francesco Totti had, and I think his retirement left a bit of a void, and that was filled by another big personality, this time in the head coach's role. I know that's very reductive, but you did ask me to answer quickly.
Yeah, to me, the biggest part of it comes back to winning a trophy. Again, I think people forget because Roma are such a big club and so sort of culturally iconic. They hadn't won anything for 14 years, and so winning something
Spalletti.
is is not to be ignored. But I do think the other part of it, I think Mourinho spoke to something that's really important in, I would say, the Roman psyche. It's true across a lot of Italian football, but I feel it a lot when I talk to fans in Rome, which is there's this sense of we're not the powerhouse from the north. We're not treated the same way as powers from the north. And having a representative who speaks truth to power in that way, who speaks up for us and says, no, we're being disrespected, and maybe it doesn't achieve anything in that sense, but it won't let people just stand on us. I think that's who Mourinho embodied for a lot of Roma fans, and I think that was important as well.
Gosh, Salernitana must love Pippo Inzaghi for going out and saying, I demand respect for my team. I think that sums it up nicely. Farewell to Jose Mourinho. I feel as a character, he will be seriously missed.
Yeah.
But onwards and upwards, hopefully, for Roma. I sort of wish we snuck in, a few more rounds of him. But anyway, it's going to be interesting for the referees. I think they'll all have a big sigh of relief from now on. Let's move on.
They've still got Iervolino to deal with, the Salernitana president. So there you go.
Oh. I do want to speak about now Milan, because I think that this is a club that has been under a lot of pressure as well. Their manager, Stefano Pioli, certainly have. We went from calling Pioli, a man on fire, Pioli is on fire, to now being somebody who is, everyone's questioning whether or not he still deserves his place as the coach. He obviously didn't manage to win the Coppa Italia match, went into this match with just a teeny bit of pressure on him. And produce a wonderful performance. Milan in general were absolutely delightful to watch. It looked like they were in control. They obviously still had their moment where they switch off, conceded a penalty to Roma, but came back and scored a magnificent goal. There's a part of you that thinks, Theo Hernandez on the left is just that. It's just so powerful to have him back in the left as opposed to being a centre-back. Question marks over Leao, whether he's ever going to really be that guy that always comes through. But Giroud, 37 years old and still such a powerful presence up front. When you have that kind of player for you, you just kind of wish he was available for every single match. But mostly, wasn't this about Pioli showing us that when people have started to criticize him tactically, whether or not he's naive in some of the decisions he makes and how he plays games, whether it's a high line, whether it's going for it against the likes of Inter, was this a case of, trust me, I know what I'm doing tactically? Nikki.
I think it was a great contrast between Jose and the things we just talked about, with ultimately his results against the top 6 teams in the league being extremely poor across his tenure at Roma. And then this sort of wonderful stat that Pioli is now by a long way the manager with the longest unbeaten record against Jose Mourinho. Jose Mourinho, I don't think anyone else has gone more than 3 games against him without losing once. Pioli's now at 6. And yeah, Roma came out and tried to attack a bit more than we've seen them do in other big games. They did try to play a more ambitious kind of football. And Milan just, again, with a decimated defence, with Gabbian Chiara at centre-back, that's neither of your first choice 2 at centre-back, just handled it and struck on the counter extremely effectively at the beginning of the game, and then managed the game wonderfully from there. I thought there was lots of really encouraging individual performances in this. I thought Adli obviously took that goal really, really well, and nice to see him coming through. I thought Loftus-Cheek, I've been frustrated by Loftus-Cheek sometimes. I think he shows flashes of things, but I think he sometimes needs to slow his feet down and take more consideration on the ball. But I thought he was good in this one. I think Milan, to me, I think Pioli has, and I think I've been mostly consistent on this podcast with this. I think some of the talk about him being fired was always a bit, to me, ridiculous, because the idea that there was someone else who was going to step in and fix this with the injury problems they had was a bit pie in the sky. And they're not going to compete for the Scudetto, I don't think. They're 9 points off it. But I think they are doing just fine, actually, in 3rd place. And I think maybe it's still his last season there, but I think he's been not always given the credit he deserves.
A victim of his own success. You know, he himself said that they were ahead of schedule when they won that Scudetto. It was a double whammy. Not only did they win the Scudetto unexpectedly with a brilliant run to do so, but they also beat Inter to the title, and Inter were the defending champions. So I think it was double the effect there. It was not only that Milan have gone and won the league title unexpectedly. When Pioli came in, he inherited that mess from Marco Giampaolo, lest we forget, feels like a lifetime ago. But they also played great football. He discovered some wonderful players along the way, the likes of Pierre Kalulu. There was that thing where those players all got better in their second season under Pioli. You know, we saw the likes of Benacer, Rafael Leao. They were all kicking on loads. And I think this season, unfortunately, came following all the big change with Maldini and Massara moving on, the big sale of Tonali, that huge investment with a portion of the, you know, using the Tonali funds as a portion of the transfer kitty in the whole thing, and no senior management figure coming out to actually defend Pioli or the club. You know, it would often be Maldini that would speak before games, and they didn't have that. So therefore, he becomes the lightning rod for all of the criticism. And the criticism was warranted because he lost 5 derbies across all competitions in a calendar year. And I think that has played into the way he's perceived by the Milan fans. I mean, it becomes stale with a coach after a while anyway, unless you continually reinvent yourself and keep winning like Pep Guardiola does. But or Jurgen Klopp, that's the exception rather than the rule. The rule is someone like Pioli, who probably has come to the end of the road now, but that doesn't warrant sacking him mid-season when he's easily going to finish in the top 4. And I think Milan are easily the 3rd best team in the league. And up until a few weeks ago, I would have said they're the 2nd best team in the league. Juventus have all surprised us a little bit. But I think they do play good football. They do bring through young players. Now he's tapping into the academy products as well. We've seen lots of debuts recently. We've seen Bartesaghi and Zeroli and Jimenez and Chaka Traore's coming in now. And then we saw Camarda. I mean, Camarda was a little bit of, I think that was more a PR move for him to say, look how short-handed I am. I'm going to give the 15-year-old a debut. But
And then the guy with the big thighs.
Who's the guy with the big thighs?
I forgot his name.
No, now I want to know.
The centre back. The centre back.
Oh,
The young
Simic,
centre-back.
Giancarlo Simic.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
Giancarlo
yeah.
Simic. Yeah, okay. So I think there have been a lot more positives than negatives. Naturally, they go out of the Champions League, but again, they go out of the Champions League in a group with Dortmund, PSG, and Newcastle. It's the hardest group they could have got.
On equal points at PSG. Well, in the end, I know it went to the last game, but it was actually not the sort of humiliation that I think it looked like at the middle point of the group. And if
and they have regrets over the goalless draws in match day 1 and 2 as well. Had they won either of those 2 matches,
this is what I mean. If we look at the actual performances that they managed in the group stage, Milan looked on top in so many of these performances. They just couldn't convert their opportunities because they are somewhat reliant on a 37-year-old because they bought 10 players in and didn't decide to go for a proper number 9 who could take over. Unless you think of Luka Jovic, who was bought on the final day of the transfer market on a 1-year contract. They didn't even expect him to be any good. In fact, he's exceeding their own expectations. So I do sort of feel like it's really bizarre the way that people have really gone for Pioli. And I'm not saying that he hasn't made mistakes, because he absolutely has, and he deserves this criticism for it. And I do question Leao's progression. Is he doing enough to sort of help Leao? Because I do feel that this is a player with so much talent and so much skill, and then I'm not seeing him to be developed day in to the extent that, for example, Lautaro Martinez has, as an example. And so I do question these things. But for Pioli, every time something's gone wrong, like when he's lost Magnan for a long period of time, for example, last season, and had to switch to a 3-man back line and find a way for Milan to still be effective. He lost Kessie, and then he lost Tonali, and then he lost Benacer, and still create a whole new midfield and still found ways to push it through. I do feel like it's, when you're up in a derby against a team that went to the Champions League final and Milan fans are upset, you still reach the semi-final of the Champions League. And I just feel like that's so overlooked because it's Inter. So it's like, put your derby ridiculousness aside.
I think Inter is defining everything.
That's
and
it.
I think when
It's
you look
tethered
at
to
the
Inter.
table,
Yeah.
Patrick mentioned it last week. Inter are setting a stupid pace this season.
Exactly.
Inter are on course to go above 90 points. Well, I say stupid, of course. There's been a few teams who've done that recently, and Napoli did it last season. Did they finish above 90?
90 on the
90.
nose, slowing down, but 90, I think.
I think if you take a step away from that and you look at it and you say, well, actually, Milan are on course for around 80 points. Is it such a disaster given the injuries they've had? I think that given they're not spending the most. They're not spending as much as Inter, Juventus, or Roma are on wages. Is it crazy to say that's pretty much, maybe it's not far exceeding expectations, but it's at least in line with them, I think.
I mean, let's be honest. Had you heard of Reinders? How many of these players have you heard of, the ones that had joined? Like, when you're a Milan fan and you hear of, this is the team of Van Basten, and you're like, well, we're going to bring in Okafor, we're going to bring in Reinders. I mean, they're good players by all means, and they will turn into great players, because we've seen a lot of talent for them, and I'm really impressed by them. But I'm saying, to expect straight away that you go into the group of death of the Champions League. He already defeated PSG with Kylian Mbappe in that team, and I do feel that sometimes people just look at it based on the derby losses. Now, I'm not saying that they haven't made mistakes, but it is exactly that. It is judging them against this team that is doing spectacularly well, because they are outspending you. I mean, Milan they're not even in the top 3 of the highest spenders in Italy.
They spent a lot on transfers this summer. I mean, we can acknowledge that. They spent
absolutely, but a lot of that is funded by Tonali's sale as well.
Yeah.
And now the sale of Krunic, and whatever it has been, getting off Ibrahimovic's salary off, and they've made that clear. So I do think also that when you have such big changes in management as well, teams suffer. You cannot have a coach who does everything, and yet he has been alone. The cheese who stands alone, he has been alone. Lost, some big members of the dressing room. I think Ibrahimovic is a big loss as well, in all honesty. And yet I do find it remarkable that he always finds a way to do something that can bring it back. And I think this was a performance that really perhaps took the heat off, until obviously the next loss, in which everyone will still be wondering.
He needs to win a derby. I don't think he will anytime soon. I don't think so. But that's how his entire Scudetto was defined. Si è girato Giroud. It was literally, they came from 1-0 down to win 2-1. Giroud scored a brace. They went ahead of Inter lost to Bologna. That was the iconic moment. There are a number of them. They won the title by 2 points, but you could look at that. And I think it's not only that they lost the derby right at the start of the season, they lost the derby 5-1. And actually, after 8 games, Milan and Inter had identical records. They'd each won 7 games. So actually, Milan set aside that because Inter lost to Sassuolo and Milan won all their games either side of the derby. And so suddenly you think, had you won that derby, that's a 6-point swing. People don't like the cliche about 6-pointers, but in this case, it really is, because it's not only 3 points that you've dropped, it's 3 points that you've given to your great rivals. And we've seen Inter aren't dropping any points. They've drawn against Bologna, they've lost against Sassuolo, they've drawn against Genoa. That's it. And they're looking like 90, if not 100 points the way they're going. And that's the problem. Milan have left themselves nowhere to go. And Pioli's reign is constantly tethered to Inter, because people are looking. Inzaghi came into Inter at more or less the same time that Pioli came into Milan. All right, they had their first full season together, I think. And people look at it that way. They see an Inter side that's playing their best football for 15 years, since Mourinho was there and they won the treble. Even then you could say how champagne was their football. Then it was winning, dominant football. And Inter gone to the Champions League final. Now they look like they'll win Serie A. In the meantime, they've won the Coppa Italia twice. They've won the Supercoppa twice. All right, they're not huge trophies, but there's a constant winning cycle that Conte brought back that league title. And since then, they've won a piece of silverware every single season. And I think that rankles with the Milan fan base. It's like, yes, we're developing, but we are still the second force in the city, and quite clearly so.
Can they actually win it, though? Here's the thing, because maybe Inter will be a little bit, they look in optimum condition. We have to talk about Inter next. They look in, I thought that they had started looking very tired, and then Çalhanoğlu does not at all look tired, not after that performance. But is there a possibility that, after going to Saudi Arabia, that they might just be, that bit more tired and somehow come back, and then Milan do a little bit of a Juventus and just park a bus somewhere, and there's a possibility of getting a 1-0 victory? Is that too...
Everything's possible, right? Everything's possible. Injuries happen, form changes. To me, the reason the league looks beyond them is because it's not just Inter, it's also Juventus who are setting a pace.
No, not the league, just to win a derby.
But 90 minutes in a derby, of course they can win a derby. You just need
Lautaro to be injured.
Yeah, basically.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, that is effectively what it is. Actually, we do have to speak about Inter because, I mean, that was astonishing performance from them. I think that there's been question marks about their performances in recent matches. People have come out to say that, you know, oh, the referees have come, whether it was obviously against Genoa with that dubious choice, and obviously question marks have been asked. Is this team good enough when Lautaro Martinez is not playing? Is the team the same without Federico Di Marco? And then we saw this terrific 5-1 victory against a team that I've described as pants several times. And it was I honestly don't know what they were thinking with that trident. I was just like, okay, let's now of all times decide to give our trio, you know, an attacking trio, the opportunity against the best team in Serie A, you know, with Lautaro Martinez in the lineup. But yeah, sure, let's do it. And it looks like Inter really felt the criticism and came determined to show that they are out there to attack. They are out there to score as many goals. They didn't stop. They kept looking for more and more. They just kept pushing up. First time in ever that Çalhanoğlu has scored 2 in a game. Lautaro Martinez, obviously 18 goals now in 18 games. He is nothing short of a phenomenon and has the opportunity, if he goes like this, to potentially match Immobile and Higuain's record of 36 goals in a match. In a season. Thuram added the cherry on top with his goal too. Are Inter definitely going to win the Scudetto?
I don't think they're definitely going to win the Scudetto, but it's impressive. It's a perfect storm with Monza, isn't it? Because Monza play that sort of pretty tiki-taka light football. We want to hog possession. We're going to play a high line defensively, and it plays perfectly into Inter's wonderful sweeping transition game. But if you look at the goals for column now, they scored 49 goals in 20 games. And if you just sort of rattle through some of their wins, they beat Fiorentina 4-0. They won the derby 5-1. They won 4-0 in Salerno when Lautaro scored 4 off the bench. 3-0 against Torino. They beat Napoli 3-0. There was the 4-0 win over Udinese recently. I mean, it's just astonishing the regularity with which they're able to score. They don't just win, they absolutely humiliate teams. And I think it was a timely reminder to all of those watching that actually it's just down to Inter, really. Yes, they dropped 2 points at Genoa, but if they're on song, and you need to also look at what a different side, like anything. We've spoken about Roma and taking Dybala out of the side. I think if you take the best player out of any team, then they're naturally not the same team at all. And we've definitely seen that with Inter, with Lautaro. Yeah. When he plays, they carry so much more of a threat because he tends to attract opposition defenders towards him. He's got that brilliant way of bringing players, teammates into play, a little bit like Giroud does with his back to goal, layoffs, the way he turns players. And again, I feel like I'm banging this drum every single week. They are having the most unbelievable season, and yet they're still only 2 points ahead of Juventus. And we have this really weird quirk of the fixture list now.
They're actually currently 5
points.
Only because Juventus are playing tonight.
Yeah,
by the time
of course. I mean, going into this weekend, the expectancy is that Juventus will move back to 2.
It is Sassuolo, though, and they love to lose to Sassuolo.
They do, but more so in Reggio Emilia than at Allianz Stadium. I remember there was a year when Fratesi and Maxime Lopez scored, but typically those wins have come in Reggio Emilia as opposed to in Turin. So we'll see how Juventus get on later. But I mean, let's say virtually, then it becomes 2 points again if Juventus win. And we mentioned Saudi Arabia briefly in passing there. I think a lot depends on what happens in Saudi Arabia. We saw it last season with Inter against Milan in the Super Cup. Inter won 3-0. Milan came back, had that wretched January where they went 7 matches without winning. And they had that bizarre sequence of they lost 1-0 to Torino, then they conceded 2, and then they conceded 3, 2 to Lazio, 2 to someone else, then 3 to Inter, then 4 to Lazio and 5 to Sassuolo, and it just all went downhill from there. I think if Inter come back fortified by winning the Super Cup, by beating Lazio and then the winner of Fiorentina and Napoli, then I think even if they are behind Juventus going into the Derby d'Italia, which by the way is at the start of February, and in between Juventus would have played Sassuolo. If they win later tonight, they go back to within 2. Inter don't play this weekend. Juventus can go top, the famous sorpasso. They can leapfrog Inter if they win at Lecce. And then Inter's next game in the league is away at Fiorentina. No guarantee they'll get maximum points. So we have a very feasible situation whereby we go into the Derby d'Italia at San Siro with Juventus ahead of Inter in the table, albeit with having played a game more. A bit like we have tonight, actually. Inter 5 points clear, albeit Juventus have a game in hand. And I think
Çalhanoğlu is not available for Fiorentina, so there's
and I think
interesting.
Suspended, and probably a needless booking that he got as well, given how that match panned out. And I think it's the one question mark I still have about Inter is psychologically, can they handle what Juventus are doing? How Juventus occasionally win ugly? How Juventus are playing down what a good squad they have, or their ambitions, all this sort of stuff. Are Inter are they going to revert to the 90s, noughties, version of themselves where it's all a big conspiracy, the world is against the, obviously there was some truth to that conspiracy. We'll touch on that on another day. But are they going to get into that victim mentality whereby the authority, the powers that be favour Juventus, the world is against us? Or are they just going to say, we are better than them and we're going to prove it definitively? We beat Milan 5-1. We could only draw 1-1 in Turin, but now we're going to win 5-1 against Juventus. And we're just going to say, this is our title and here's why.
Yeah, I mean, I do say, like, Nikki, I mean, if we are talking about sort of Pazza Inter, they still did find that goal against Hellas Verona, pants down, Fratesi, like, screaming. Obviously, they conceded the penalty straight after. But are we maybe perhaps seeing a more professional Inter side? And will they be buoyed? I never know how to pronounce that word properly. Buoyed? Anyway, that's the one. By a potential... Buoyed by a potential Supercoppa victory. I mean, Atletico Madrid is a hard team to take on. They can be very exhausting to play twice against Cholo Simeone's Atletico's side. And, you have that coming up as well in February. But when you look at this Inter side and the ability and the players that they do have available to them, do you think there's a potential that playing every 3 games is eventually gonna come to them? Remember this, yes, because they always seem to start. January is a special month for them, because I remember last year they thrashed Napoli too in January. And I say thrashed, I mean they beat
1-0.
Napoli and they were the first team to do so. But it was a great performance from Inter that had conceded like a ton of goals prior to that. So is it always that they start off the season well and then the games that you expect them to win are the ones they sometimes actually end up losing?
I think there's too much season left to pretend that it isn't possible. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can happen in like season left. And actually, if you wanted to raise a concern flag, I don't know why it's a flag, it's just a flag in my head. But if you wanted to raise concern for Inter, actually from these last results, it's not so much even that they drew with Genoa, it's the fact that they've conceded in 4 of the last 5 games, I think. Whereas before, earlier this season, we were talking about what an incredible run of clean sheets they have. They have started conceding goals. Now, this is not a big concern flag. It's one of those little sort of like, the ones people wave at the end of the proms, the little ones that you can just hold in your hand. It's not a big one. But
Proms.
I couldn't think of a small flag for anything else. I was like, where do people have small flags? The proms. So our non-English listeners will have no idea what that even means. But yeah, look, they look less impenetrable than they once did. They almost conceded another goal to Monza. You were talking about players' thighs earlier, Mina, so I have to just say there was a special moment with the VAR look at Pessina's goal that got disallowed, where it just had this like perfect simulated version of Bastoni's butt. Like, is his butt quite sticking out enough to be in the way of Pessina's goal? I think you have to look at it where we are now and say Inter have got a plus 39 goal difference from 20 games, and that is bonkers. So are they the best team in Italy right now? Yes. Is it close? I don't think it's that close.
No.
But in the end, you still only get 3 points for a win. And if Juventus keep doing what they're doing, then yes, the pressure's going to be on in Inter. And at some point, pressure can tell on a team. So it's not a foregone conclusion. but the same as it was, I think, when we asked her a week or two ago, if you ask me who I think is going to win the league, I'm going to say the best team, and Inter are the best team.
Well, to be honest with you, I can't disagree with that. I mean, frankly speaking, the way that they're going right now, it's nothing short of astonishing. Congratulations to Chanloglu, though, for managing to score a brace for the first time in 222 games. I do want to talk a little about Lazio as well, just because, it's almost juxtapositioned against what's going on in Roma. But I do feel like this is a team that we've been pretty harsh about in general. They defeated Lecce 1-0 over this weekend. And honestly, now when we're looking at their records, they have slowly started to find themselves again, slowly starting to pick up a good run of wins. And this is their 4th consecutive victory in the league, 5th overall. Last week, Patrick and I both chose Lazio as a potential 4th side to make the top 4. I'm always a little bit nervous about that, but I'm always a bit nervous about them, but I do love the fact that Sarri, who always has a style of play that he's very famous for, but he understands also how to be pragmatic when necessary to get Lazio the wins. And sometimes that has been to change the style with the likes of Guendouzi and Rovella in midfield to try to achieve the wins that they have achieved. Lecce have actually been a tough opponent for them. They can't seem to beat them, and then managed a 1-0. I thought Lecce overall planned this perfectly, and very much, had they actually had proper goal scorers, could have well tied or even won this game actually. But Lazio is slowly creeping up there. Do we believe that they could finish in top 4, or is this just a fluke? Because they beat Roma too, and I don't think they've been getting any recognition.
I think it's 5 straight wins, isn't it, in all competitions? And they have that knack of winning 1-0. They had the best. They didn't have the best defence in Serie A last season, but they had the most clean sheets. So I think he has found a way of making up.
And Immobile coming off with injuries, and Tati Castellanos with injury. It's not. I mean, they've lost Milinkovic-Savic, yet they're finding ways.
Yeah, they've done a good job. Even last season, they had 4 players in double figures. That he finds a way of getting goals from somewhere. Whether it's Zaccagni's been quiet this season in terms of his output, but there's always a player who's able to pitch in with a goal, be it one of those midfielders like we've seen Guendouzi score. He scored at Empoli, he scored in the cup against Genoa. They seem to have enough. Felipe Anderson getting the winner this weekend. I think they have just enough squad depth, and they have a very creative coach, and a coach who has a wonderful track record. And the reason I picked Lazio last week to finish in the top 4 is because I see 3 teams that are a long way ahead of the rest. But I think he is the difference maker for Lazio. You could make a case that Fiorentina have a very capable coach in Vincenzo Italiano, but I still think he can't compete with Sarri in terms of experience and Nelson having been there and done it. Sarri's also won the Scudetto, lest we forget. I know you will say it was a Juventus side, and we'll come back to what we had before, Ronaldo and so on and so forth. But I just think he's the difference maker, really. He's finished, again, if you want to look at what Roma have achieved in terms of their ability to win the Conference League and make the Europa League final, Lazio, I think, will also say they got back in the Champions League. They were runners-up last season, and they have dominated the derby since Sarri's been there. So there's a little bit of what we were saying earlier about Milan and Inter. Lazio will look at it as they are the best team in Rome domestically and have been since Sarri's been at the club. And I just think over the course of what remains of the season, they've got the boost from going through to the Coppa Italia semi-finals, and I think he's being a bit disingenuous saying he's not bothered about that. I think he would love to get one over on Juventus and possibly win that trophy. So I can see only positive things for Lazio. Yes, they'll have 2 Champions League matches, but their run will end there, and I'm not even sure how strong a team he will pick. He probably has to pick a strong team so as not to be humiliated by Bayern. But I think they probably know that's a foregone conclusion already.
I really hope Sarri comes out and says that this is a ridiculous competition anyway. I would.
It would be very Maurizio Sarri to be the one manager who can say, no, I'm going to focus on more important things. We're not going to win the Champions League.
Yeah, I remember a long time ago. I follow this Arsenal account that makes me laugh all the time. But I just remember saying that, remember reading during the time that Wenger was in charge, and it said, let's forget about the Champions League because it doesn't matter. The only thing we should focus on is getting in the top 4 so we make it to the Champions League next season so that we can get knocked out and try again. And it just always made me laugh. And I kind of see like that this is sort of the way that a lot of actually teams seem to be doing it these days. Worth mentioning that Bologna having quite a rough time at the moment, not winning the games like they used to with such ease. Ranieri's Cagliari defeated them 2-1. Big shout out to Atalanta, who destroyed Frosinone 5-0. That was some performance from them. Torino, the great Torino side that defeated Napoli 3-0, didn't have a single shot on target against Genoa. And this is a Dragosin-less Genoa side. Empoli lost 2-1 to Verona, leading to Andrea Azzoli's sacking. So I was going to say apologies there, but I'm not the one who sacked him. And I think, Fiorentina 2-2 against Udinese. Cabral coming in and scoring goals. Have they found the striker that they've been looking for? Anything else anyone of you would like to come up and mention?
No, I think I'm going to, for the sake of poor producer Simon, who I think would love us to because we've run long this week, understandably, big topic this week, would love us to wrap it up. I'm going to say a very quick shout outs to some new Chronicles Tifosi we got this week, new Patreon subscribers, Tom Gotts, David Coates and Matthew Ridley. Thank you so much for supporting the show. Love to have you with us. And for everyone else, just a reminder that you can sign up for the Patreon. I'm sorry, I'm reading something on our little running order and it doesn't follow, so I'm confusing myself. Yes, you can sign up for our Patreon, SerieChronicles.com, if you want more on that. You can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, all the usual social spots, and you'll find links to all of that stuff and links in the show notes to this podcast as well. Thanks so much for listening, and we will be back very soon. Bye.
Ciao.
Serie Chronicles is a Media Chronicles production.